Hello everybody, and welcome back to another guide. Uh, Today we're going to be talking about Frost Mage, and the talents that you'll choose, the Azerite traits that are going to work best for you, a general play style. Um, I've got a specific macro that I use to help brighten up the water elemental AI, and we'll see what we get through. Now, in comparison to Fire and Arcane, Frost Mage is very simple in my opinion. There's not much to understand. It's very clear cut in the playstyle, and I think there's a lot of good things about that. Because if you're into mythic raiding, or you're just getting into mythic raiding, or you're in heroic and you're learning the mechanics, when you play Frost, you don't have to worry about thinking, you know, allocating too much brain power to, what you're doing. Um, There'd be some small things on, when to hold cooldowns and stuff like that, but that stuff we'll get into in this video, and I hope we can all learn a few lessons. So right off the bat, I guess the best place to start is, is your uh, is your talents. So on the first tier, we have Bone Chilling, Lonely Winter, and Ice Nova. Ice Nova is good for PvP, but there's not really a reason in PvE, which is what this video is going to generally be about, for a 2-second root. It does do damage, but there's never really a time that you're going to... The big advantage of this is that it applies CC. Here we have Lonely Winter, and Lonely Winter was very popular in Legion. In fact, if you didn't take Lonely Winter, I would have called you an idiot. But what it does is that you no longer can spawn your water elemental, but it increases the damage of your Frostbolt, Ice Lance, and Flurry by 25%. Now, that sounds really good, but right now, just simming in general, Bone Chilling is going to give you better, just in as strict numbers, Bone Chilling is going to give you more damage than Lonely Winter. And on top of that, now you also get your Water Elemental, and you can do things like using its freeze ability. And we'll get into that in just a second. So next tier, we're going to have the Shimmer tier, and I joked about this in my Arcane video, and it still rings true. You're going to have a very hard time convincing any mage to not take Shimmer. Shimmer makes Blink, which is already a good ability, 10 times better. I take this on all my specs, and I've never not taken Shimmer. And the day that Shimmer becomes not as viable as to another trait is going to be a very weird day for me, because I'm going to have to learn. I'm going to have to unlearn a lot of things. Uh, then we got Glacial Insulation. Ice Barrier increases your armor by 200% while active, and Ice Block applies Ice Barrier to you when it fades. Now this is interesting. It's in Legion. I think this would have been a really good spell. But in today's Mythic Plus or raid scenarios, there's no real one-shot abilities that you don't want to expend your ice block on. And then you also have to take into consideration that with Cold Snap, you get the possibility of 2 ice blocks within the span of 5 minutes, which is really good. You can cheese a lot of mechanics that way. Or, just make up for your poor positioning, all that jazz. And that's uh and so I don't know, the 200% armor while active is really impressive. So one thing that I really enjoyed about Fire in Mythic Plus and Legion is that your Fire Barrier would give you increased armor, and you could use that, and it would prevent a lot of one-shot abilities. So you can see right here, this is a weak aura that shows me my effective health. So P stands for physical, M stands for magical. So if we have, you can see while I have it active, it absorbs 42,000 damage. So basically, whatever my base physical or magic effective health is just going to increase that by 42 points, 42,670. And also you have the minor advantage of melee attackers are slowed by 65%, but that's more of a PvP thing. Now, if we take Glacial Insulation, it'll increase my armor by 200%. So you'll see that when I use my thing here. Now my physical resistances is insane because armor does it works against physical resistance. So now it's, if there were a one-shot ability in Mythic Plus or Raid or something like that, this would be a really good talent to choose, I think. But Blizzard is really straight away from that. Like in Legion, there were a lot of one-shot mechanics, more specifically in Mythic Plus. And I think that would be a really good spell for then. But as of right now, I'm just going to take Shimmer 100% of the time. Then we got Icy Flow or Ice Flows, which is really good. But I don't know. I obviously just prefer Shimmer. Makes your next Mage spell cast time within a short. Basically, if the cast time is less than 10 seconds, it's castable while moving. And it's just you hit it, and then arbitrarily you can now cast Frostbolt once while you're running. That's nice, but Shimmer just seems to work better. Then we get into the tier 3, and we have Encounter's Flow, Mirror Image, or Rune of Power. Mirror Image, you don't take. Just the numbers aren't worth it, and a 2-minute cooldown is kind of clunky with a lot of our CDs. Like it's 3 minutes for Frost, it is 2 minutes on Combustion and Fire, and it's 1:30 for Arcane. So it never really lines up. I guess it lines up nicely for our Fire, but even then you're going to want to take Rune of Power so you can really pump your damage. But that's for another video. Here we're going to want to take Encounter's Flow. It works the best with Glacial Spike, I believe, because you can actually really play around it better than you could with Fire or Arcane, where playing around with Rune of Power is much easier, or you get more bang for your buck, I think. Encounter's Flow, basically it goes up and down within 5 stacks, and then when it's at 5 stacks, you get 20% increased damage. When it's at 1, you get 4, so at 2 you get 8, at 3 you get 12. You see the pattern. And it goes up and down cycling every 10 seconds. So what you can do is that you can kind of hold your Glacial Spike combo until you're around 3 stacks, and when you're done casting, you'll now be at 5 stacks of Encounter's Flow, and you'll do like I've seen myself do a 100k Glacial Spike because I think I had a pot running, Potion of Intellect, so that's going to bump my numbers a little bit there, and I had to have been at 5 stacks of Encounter's Flow. So that's how you would achieve something like that. Now on the tier 4, we got Chain Reaction, Frozen Touch, or Ebon Bolt. Frozen Touch, your Frostbolt grants you Fingers of Frost and Brain Freeze 20% more often. That sounds nice on paper, but it's less, I don't know. Ebon Bolt's more reliable, and we'll get to why in a second. Chain Reaction, your Ice Lances against frozen targets increase your damage of your Ice Lances by 3% for 10 seconds, stacking up for 5 times. This could be really good, but the numbers don't really... if this got a buff, maybe this would be more viable, especially on AoE when you're using your Frozen Orb on a lot of targets, so you can really stack that up really quickly to get a 15% increased damage on those. That would feel pretty good. This is actually this is a legendary, but it just doesn't feel as good as it did. Now we got Ebon Bolt, and Ebon Bolt's really nice because it's on a 45-second cooldown, but the one thing that it does provide is a guaranteed Brain Freeze proc. And you can use that when there'll be times where you're at 5 icicles for your Glacial Spike, and we'll get to Glacial Spike in a minute, and you just won't get a Flurry proc. And we'll get into playstyle of the Flurry proc combo, but it's really important to have a Flurry proc for your Glacial Spike. You don't want to cast it unless you have one. We'll get into that in a second. So if Ebon Bolt's off cooldown, you'll just cast Ebon Bolt and not use the Flurry, and then now you have a free Brain Freeze proc that you can chain into your Glacial Spike. So it's on demand. You can play around it. You know when you're gonna have this, and it's really nice to have that consistency, I guess is the big word I'm trying to push here. Tier 5 is personal choice. Ice Ward is nice, and we'll get to how I kind of use that in a second. Frigid Winds is your tank's best friend in Mythic Plus. Basically, it makes your slows become 70%, 75, or 65 rather. I don't know the exact slow, but basically you now have a roughly 70% slow on anything that, like, your Blizzard, your Frostbolt, your Frozen Orb touches. Anything that creates a slow now gives them a 70-ish% slow for 15 seconds, and that just makes kiting really easy for a tank, which is very important in Mythic Plus. Ice Ward is nice. Your Frozen Nova now has 2 charges. on a like 30-second recharge, and that's really nice for controlling mobs. So there's certain fights where I would recommend this for like raid encounters. The Silithid warriors and Zekvaz if you're really trying to hold them still. So the your blood decay arbitrarily. Mass grips them in, then you frozen nova, and if you have ice ward, once it breaks, you can frozen nova again, and it really just holds them in place. So if your team doesn't have a lot of guaranteed CC, then that might be a choice that you want to take. And obviously, this tier is completely personal preference. Now, Rune of Power is the one thing I would advise not taking, as it's not very useful in a raid scenario, and it's not very useful. It could be useful in a Mythic Plus scenario, but I never use it. Let me put it that way. It's more of a PvP talent that you would take. And now we're at the tier. Man, I lost count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Tier 6. So we've got Freezing Rain, Splitting Ice, or Comet Storm. Freezing Rain, Frozen Orb makes Blizzard instant cast, increases its damage done by 50% for 12 seconds. That was stock for Frost Mages when you had your weapon back in Legion, and it feels really bad that it's not just baseline now and you have to commit an entire talent to it. Just does not feel good. But this would be, you could argue that this might be good for like Mythic Plus, but I don't see anyone taking it, so my assumption is that the numbers just don't make it worth. Though instant cast blizzards are pretty pristine. You can fit 2 in the amount of time that Frozen Orb is out, if I remember correctly. Splitting Ice and Comet Storm are basically the 2 that you're going to be choosing, and you got to think to yourself, so I'll tell you right off the bat, Comet Storm's going to give you better single target damage, because if it's only single target, you're not going to get any benefit out of Splitting Ice. But you can, if you have Splitting Ice, it does a lot of damage in Mythic Plus. I would still recommend that you take Comet Storm. But there was a time, I would say about when I was starting to push 12s and 13s, now I'm on to like 14s and 15s, where Splitting Ice did more overall damage for me, because if you have a pack that lives long enough to get 2 Comet Storms in, then this is going to override Splitting Ice in a big way. But if you have a pack, and this is what I'm getting at for like 12s and 13s, is that they would tend to die just before my Comet Storm came off CD. For my second go around, and just getting 1 in is initial really big burst, but after that the only thing you have is your Frozen Orb and then your Blizzard, and that's okay. But Splitting Ice is very consistent. Very consistent damage throughout the entire time. So at 12s and 13s, where Trash was dying too quickly, was it was living long enough for me to it was living long enough to make Comet Storm kind of lose its worth, but it wasn't living long enough to where the point Comet Storm would come off its 30-second cooldown and I could use it again. Now that I'm pushing 14s, 15s, the Trash tends to last a little longer, and Comet Storm really is, the first one's kind of like laying down that thick damage, and then at the end it's more of like an execute, you could kind of think of. And that's kind of my thought process between the two. Next we have Thermal Void, Ray of Frost, and Glacial Spike. Thermal Void was good in Legion. It's not the numbers just don't work out right now. Ray of Frost is really good for open world in my opinion. I like it a lot. But Glacial Spike is what you're going to want to take for raids and Mythic Plus. Glacial Spike is probably my favorite ability out of all of Frostmage kit. It just feels super good, and how it does is that your mastery as a Frostmage, it gives you icicles, and it increases the damages that your icicles do. And if you don't have Glacial Spike and you have Thermal Void, whenever you use an Ice Lance, your stored icicles that kind of sit here above your character will be thrown into the target, and they'll do additional damage. And that's really nice, but with Glacial Spike is whenever you use an Ice Lance, it doesn't do that. And it stores your icicles up to 5. And once you have 5 icicles, you can transform them into a Glacial Spike. And it's a 3-second cast, but man, does it pack a punch. Like I was saying earlier, I got like a 100k Glacial Spike crit. And it crits more because of how our shatter passive works, and we'll get into that in a second. But really love this ability, and I recommend taking it 100% of the time. Ray of Frost is really good, more of a PvP setting. but obviously it's a PvE video. Now for open world talents, I highly recommend Concentrated Coolness because it allows you to place your frozen orb as instead of having to it when you're not in open world or you're not in PvP, then your frozen orb will just fly out in front of you and it'll stop at the first thing that it hits, and that's not always optimal. So I'm a big advocate of if you're in Mythic Plus or something, you blink into the pack and then drop your frozen orb so it's right in the middle hitting everything as opposed to stopping at the first guy. And packs never are clean in a tight bundle like this, so it stops at the first guy and it's only hitting like 2 or 3. But if you blink in, you're going to hit a lot of them. Now for open world, you can take Concentrated Coolness and it allows you to, it increases the size, damage, and it allows you to place it instead of shooting it out, which I think is really nice. Deep Shatter is something I just kind of take. It's a kind of plug and forget. Your Frostbolt deals 150% additional damage to frozen targets, which is nice. So if you're doing your flurry combo or you have them frozen in a root, your frostbolts will do additional damage. And then temporal shield is just so nice. Envelops you in a temporal shield for 6 seconds, and 100% of all damage taken while shielded will be instantly restored while the shield once the shield ends. So important caveat there is that if you have temporal shield up and you die with it, you're not going to get that health back. So you gotta be at least high enough health that in the next 6 seconds you're not going to die. But then after that 6 seconds, you're going to get all that HP that you lost right back. So it's really nice. It's basically you're immune to damage, quote unquote, for 6 seconds because you're just going to get it back anyway. So it's not it's nice for doing like world bosses and stuff like that because they pack a punch, and with the right use of healing potions and temporal shields, you can be really healthy out in the open world. Now, we'll get to Azerite traits. Now, I'm a little unfortunate when it comes to Frost Azerite traits, but that's not bad because there are a lot of Azerite traits that I think are very viable across the board. The one I take right now is Whiteout, and that's because I primarily use Frost for Mythic Plus and then one specific fight in Mythic Antorus, and that is Mythic Vectis. And basically, the way it works is that ads keep spawning, and it's very high priority that you kill them. And what Whiteout does on this head is that Ice Lance deals an additional damage, and I'll be taking Splitting Ice on that fight. That's an important part, is that I'll take Splitting Ice on that fight. So now my Ice Lances are dealing extra damage, and they're critting on both of them because I've got a Fingers of Frost proc. And it's just a ton of damage. But the important part is that it reduces the cooldown of Frozen Orb by 0.5 seconds every Ice Lance that you do. Now, the reason why I took that, so you guys can follow me, is that my Frozen Orb, it kind of was in a weird CD where it didn't line up well with when one of the ads spawned, and you want to get rid of this. You want to put Frozen Orb on CD as much as possible to get the effective out of. Well, you take that with a grain of salt, but in that situation, you want to make sure that you're not holding onto your Frozen Orb for very long. So what I was doing is I was putting down a Blizzard, and Blizzard will reduce the cooldown of your Frozen Orb every 0.5 seconds for every time it ticks. So anything that it hits, it'll reduce the cooldown. So what I was doing was I was wasting 2 seconds to cast Blizzard, so that my Frozen Orb CD would come up a little sooner, so it lined up better with an ad and my CDs. It was like the perfect storm. So I took Whiteout instead, and because my Ice Lances were lowering the cooldown of my Frozen Orb, I didn't have to waste time using Blizzard, and therefore it increased my damage. So if you want, hopefully you can track with me there. But because Frost Mage, our secondary stats, they're all very useful. So you can take a lot of different Azerite traits and do very well with them. I would recommend taking the highest item level one you have, though there is the caveat that you don't really want to take the Frost choice 90% of the time. Like Razan's Fury is pretty good. I would, if I wasn't using Frost for only a handful of things, then I would take Razan's Fury. But Whiteout really works best for me, and that's what I invested it into. But off the top of my head, ones that are really good for Frost are Dagger in the Back, Tidal Surge, Champion of Azeroth, Razan's Fury, Unstable Catalyst are all really good ones. But obviously, you always want to make sure that you have at least one Archive of the Titans. And because I don't really have other ones, and it's with Frost Mage, Fire Mage, and Arcane Mage, it's best to stack 2 of the different ones, and then 1 of the Archive of the Titans. But I don't have that luxury on Frost, so I have 2 Archive of the Titans and 1 Whiteout. Archive of the Titans basically increases your intellect, stacking up to 20. And we'll see up here in my buffs in just a second. We'll see we got the Archive of the Titans. Now it increases it by 26, and it's multiplicative. So now I'm at 52, and it slowly goes all the way up to 20, and you just get free intellect, and it's really nice. And then within Uldir, you get you also get the Reorigination Array. And that's really nice because it'll increase your crit to where you want it to be. And we'll explain that in just a second. So I recommend having at least one Archive of the Titans, and then stack 2 of the same ones, whether it be Dagger in the Back, Tidal Surge, Resoundless Fury, etc., Unstable Catalyst. You get the idea. So yeah, now we'll get into secondary stats. So Crit Strike is really important. But it's not something you want to stack without regard to your other secondary stats. Like, you don't want to pump everything in a crit, but then have 5% haste, 2% versatility, 12% mastery. Having that high of crit isn't important if you're not supplementing it with your other secondary stats. That's very important. So that being said, a general rule is that with Frost Mage, you want to get your crit to roughly 33%. 31 to 33 is that sweet spot that you kind of want to reach. And with the Reorigination Array, on top of having 20% crit right now for myself, I'm sitting at about 30% crit while in Uldir, and that's a really nice place to be. And I'll explain that really briefly right now. So basically there's the Shatter passive, and it multiplies the critical strike chance of your spells against frozen targets by 1.5 and adds an additional 50% crit strike chance. So if we do the math really quick, if I have 30% crit like I do in Uldir, and we take in my passive of Shatter, we will learn that 30 times 1.5 is 45, and then adds an additional 50% crit strike chance. So that means if my target is considered frozen, then I have a 95% crit chance on any of my abilities. And so that is insane. That's why you want to get to your 30%, 33% crit. Now, it is important to note that if you go above 33% crit, that is a bad thing, because now you're wasting secondary stats that you could have. Because once you get past 33%, 33.3, it takes you to 100% crit. Anything above that, now you're just wasting crit, if you follow me. So that's why crit's important. Obviously, haste is really nice to cast your abilities. Versatility is really high. That's why I have 9.6. I kind of push for a little versatility. You'll see I've got haste verse ring here. I've got a crit haste ring here with enchants on crit, and then enchant crit here. And so haste is really good. And so, but it's one of those things where you don't want too much. You got to find that sweet spot, and that's when I really recommend simming. And we'll talk about that just after this. Versatility is the same on every spec, just like crit haste. Basically, it increases the damage you do by a flat 9.65%. And what's not great about flat increased damage? Versatility is very good for Frost. Any of the mage specs, really. And then on the flip side of the coin, it also takes half of your versatility, and that decreases the damage taken by that. So I take 4.82% reduced damage. And that's also important, because as a cloth wearer, we tend to be a little squishy, so I'll take any versatility that I'll get as for defensive. Now, your mastery is... This is when we talked about the icicles. Your mastery, casting Frostbolt or Flurry, grants you an icicle. Casting Ice Lance causes all icicles stored to be launched at the target, each dealing 1.7 k damage, frost damage. Up to 5 icicles can be stored. Any excess icicles gained will automatically launch one. So basically, if you have 5, it'll throw out the Ice Lance, or the icicle. And it increases your damage by Frozen Orb by 30%. Now, because we take our Glacial Spike, that doesn't apply to us, though Mastery does increase its damage, so it's nice to have a little bit of Mastery. I would say that Mastery is our worst secondary stat, but if you like hitting those big, meaty Glacial Spike hits, like I think anyone does, then, having you want to have a little bit of Mastery. So what I'm saying here is that Frost has this benefit of the fact that you can... anything, all your secondary stats are pretty evenly weighted. And that's why I don't sim this character very much, or this spec very much, because I can basically take the highest item level, especially with how powerful Intellect is right now. I'm generally going to want to take the highest item level that I can. Like see I'm 383.3 out of 385.5, and that's mostly to do with sockets and stuff, and that has less to see. I'm taking a 380. I'm taking a 380 offhand when I could take a 385, but this has a socket, and sockets are worth about 15 item levels. Um, so yeah, you can sim your character. I recommend getting the Simulation Craft add-on. So you type in SimC here, it'll give you a bit of code, and you copy this, say OK, and then you paste it into RaidBots, and it'll give you, there's a lot of things you can do with that, but mostly it'll just tell you how, what your, the favorite one to do is a 5-minute patchwork, and that means your character is stood still the entire time, and it's playing your class as efficiently as possible, and usually the favorite time is about 5 minutes. And so you'll have so a lot of people ask like, oh, what is your character sim? And most people, it's expected that you'll respond with your 5-minute patchwork simulation. I don't know what this is off the top of my head. I think it's around 15k. Which is significantly lower than my Fire and my Arcane. And that's why I don't play Frost as much right now, especially in a raid environment. Though in Vectis, you get a lot of benefit out of it because it has splitting ice. And the idea on Mythic Vectis is that you want to attack the ad and cleave off the ad onto the boss. And because you have splitting ice, which it's your Ebon Bolt, your Glacial Spike, and your Ice Lance, they'll do increased your Ice Lance will do increased damage, but it'll also hit a second target for 80% of its damage, and that includes Ebon Bolt and Glacial Spike. So that's a ton of damage that you're cleaving off onto the boss while still doing your job as prioritizing the ad damage. Anything that's really important. I can't stress that enough. But yeah, so that's a rough thing about Simulation Craft. If you're interested, I would watch a video on how to do it. It's very nice because it'll tell you your stat weights, and I think that's really important. So you have a general idea of what you want to, you want to push for as your secondary stats. You really learn your character that way, and it's math. World of Warcraft is a math game when it really comes down to it. I don't know. I was going to explain it, but I don't want to go into that now. And so having the best way your character can play. And obviously there's a lot of human error, and I don't play this class, any of my classes, perfectly, so I'm never going to get what my simulated results are. But it's a good idea of like, oh man, this sims for 15k, but I'm doing 14k on that last fight. I think I'm killing it. So, this is something nice to have in the back of your mind. So now let's get into rotation. It's now rotation for Frost Mage is very, very simple in my opinion. And so basically you just cast Frostbolt until you get to 5 stacks of your icicles. You can see it's building up here. See how everything kind of crit there, and that's to do with my shatter. And now that I'm at 5 icicles, but I don't have a flurry proc, so what am I going to do? I'm going to hit Ebon Bolt, and I'm going to go into Glacial Spike, into a flurry, and follow that up with an Ice Lance. And the reason why you follow it up with an Ice Lance is that when you use Flurry, when you have a Flurry proc, it kind of goes in bolts of 3. And you'll see that when I get a proc. I'm recording, so it's unlikely that I'll ever get one. So here we go. So watch here. You'll see the debuff that it applies. There, see how it keeps getting reset? And it's a slow traveling ability, in my opinion. And so the idea is that if you're casting an ability like Glacial Spike, what your Brain Freeze proc will do is your next flurry is instant cast and deals 50% increased damage and will apply Winter's Chill to the target. Winter's Chill makes the target appear to the code that it's frozen. So that means you'll get your 95% crit chance if you have 30% crit in Uldir on your Glacial Spike. So that basically means you never have to worry about not critting on your Glacial Spike, which is a lot of peace of mind. So we'll go into an Ebon Bolt to get a free Flurry proc, and then the combo, any any Brain Freeze combo is always going to be followed up with an Ice Lance because it hits in those bolts, and so for a little bit after your main ability has been hit and your flurry is still going through, you have a chance to toss in an Ice Lance. Now, because the target is considered frozen, it's going to do triple damage and have a 95% chance to crit. So anytime you get a Brain Freeze proc, and you want to use it on Frostbolt or whatever, or you're always going to follow it up with an Ice Lance. And now we're also going to get other procs, and I'm going to kind of force some here. These are your Fingers of Frost procs, and they're just your run-of-the-mill. You just toss an Ice Lance, and it's going to do that extra damage. If you get a Fingers of Frost proc, it's just going to cause your Ice Lance to be a free crit, basically. And so what you gotta kind of think of is that you don't want to do a Glacial Spike or a Flurry combo with a Fingers of Frost proc, because you're gonna get a free one. With the fact that, see right there, see how it crit because it still had the Winter's Reach on it. Now, if you have a free one like that, you don't want to use it during your Flurry combo, is kind of what I call it, because that's kind of you're wasting a proc basically. So yeah, let's talk opener really quick. So let me reset my data here, and we'll get into it. So on your opener, what you want to do is you just want to cast your Frostbolt until you get to 5 stacks of icicles. Now, if you get a flurry proc while you are before you're at 5 stacks, and it's at the beginning of the fight, so your Ebon Bolt's going to be guaranteed off cooldown. You're going to want to use every flurry proc you get until you're at 5 icicles, and then if you get a flurry proc at 5 icicles, even better. But you're probably not because you used one anyway. Then you're gonna use your Ebon Bolt into your flurry combo. Now, if your Ebon Bolt is on CD, then you're going to want to play a little, you're going to want to hold on to your flurry procs basically. So I got one here, but I know that within one more Frostbolt cast, I'm going to be at full icicles. So I'm not going to use it on this one. I'm going to save it because I know my Glacial Spike is going to come up, and I don't want to use Glacial Spike unless I have a Brain Freeze proc. That's very important. You do not want to use it's a waste of it, because you really want your Glacial, it's not worth casting unless you're going to guarantee crit. So that's really important. So let's talk opener here. I'll basically just give you a rundown of how I usually do it. So obviously we have our Icy Veins, which we're going to use. It's a 3-minute CD, increases your haste by 30%. You're probably going to have Lust. I'm not going to do that just because I'd have to wait 10 minutes in between each time I want to demonstrate. And then you're going to use any racials or on-use trinkets and all that jazz. So if we do a pull 5, we're going to pre-pot at like 3 and then start pre-casting. And then we're going to go into our Icy Veins, our Racial. We're going to use this Flurry proc because we know we have an Ebon Bolt now. And we're going to go into our Glacial Spike. And then you're going to want to use like your Comet Storm if you're taking it. You're going to pop out your Frozen Orb so you can get your Frozen Orb. Also, every tick has a 14% chance to generate a Fingers of Frost proc, so it's important that you use it. And so yeah, you're just gonna, and then you're back into your regular rotation. And that's why I say Frost is really simple, because you use your CDs like your Comet Storm and your Frozen Orb when it comes up. And then here's something that you might run into a lot, is you're gonna be sitting at 5 icicles, but you don't have a proc. So you're just gonna have to keep casting Frostbolt. I know it sucks, but this is part of the RNG that the class is. And then into a Glacial Spike once you get that Flurry proc. And that's why you kind of want to save the Flurry procs at around 3 icicles, because it's like hedging your bets. It's like, well, I now know that I've guaranteed a Brain Freeze proc. And yeah, that's basically your rotation. It's super simple, very, very nice. Now, when it gets to AoE, it becomes a little more complicated. We'll demonstrate here. So there's something really cool that, because we take our Water Elemental, that the Water Elemental has, and that is AoE root that is castable from 40 yards of wherever your Elemental is. So obviously I can't do it over there, see the little red X, but I can do it over here, even though because my Water Elemental's in range. Now if we remember our Shatter proc, it will crit, it'll give increased crit to anything that's frozen. So if you're doing AoE, Comet Storm is a big AoE cooldown because it hits everything around it, and it does 21,000 frost damage to all enemies within 6 yards. So it's not 21,000 damage spread, it's 21,000 damage done to every single individual enemy. And what you want to do is you want to use your freeze so that those will crit more likely, uh, will have a higher chance of critting. Now you can also do that with your Frozen Nova, and see how they're frozen. So if I were to use a Comet Storm here, see how those are all critting? That's a ton of damage. So you want to really play around that. And the reason why your Water Elemental freeze, oops, I have it on a, we'll get into macros a second, but I have a mouse over macro that I highly recommend you guys copy. But yeah, you have, you won't have to be in melee range to get the crit on your Comet Storm. So that's really, really nice. Now, one thing that, can I root this? Okay, cool. Well, I gotta wait 5 seconds. So what you'll do is you'll cast your Comet Storm and you'll hold off on your freeze for just a second because you want to freeze them just before the comets hit. And there's some time before the comets actually hit after you cast it, and you'll see it here. So I'll cast it now, and then cast my freeze, and it'll crit all of those, and it'll last longer because you casted it, you held onto it a little later. Now, any root ability will have its time reduced by for how much damage it takes. So the longer you hold onto it, the longer you're gonna have because you see how it came in bolts. There's 7 of them, so it's not just straight AOE right away. It's kind of like your flurry, how it comes down in bolts. So you want to like make sure you're getting as many of those frozen as possible. Now, a really cool thing you can also do is if you're somewhere where you can freeze the opponent, so more likely than not Mythic Plus. Let's get rid of this really quick. What you can do is you can cast a Glacial Spike and then use a Frozen Nova just as it. So you want to be spamming it just as your Glacial Spike finishes, and you see how I got that to crit even though I didn't have a flurry proc. So there's a lot of things you want to play around like that. And that's why Ice Ward can also be really good, because now you have 2 of those that you can use to crit Glacial Spikes, or maybe you accidentally used your freeze in a bad spot, so now you have your Frozen Nova to crit your Comet Storms. So that's all really important. Yeah, I'm not sure there's too much to talk about. I'm not as prepared as my Arcane video, since I don't think there's much to talk about when it does come to Frost. But I guess one thing I should talk about is movement as a Frost Mage. Macros, also macros, my bad. We'll talk about that just after this. So a big thing is that with Frost, we get a lot of instant cast abilities through procs. So if you're in a raid or a Mythic Plus scenario, anytime that you have a instant cast, you should take the advantage to use that GCD to move. And the global cooldown basically is that you see every time I use an ability, all my abilities go on what's called the global cooldown. And so if I'm using an instant cast ability, it's going to be on a cooldown, on a GCD. So you can take that time to move. Now the biggest one here is the fact that you use 2 GCDs with your Brain Freeze and your followed up Ice Lance. So you have a lot of time that you can move before you need to start casting again. And I highly recommend that people get into the habit of using their GCDs to move, because it's not like you can cast anyway, but you're not losing any uptime because you can't cast then anyway. So you can do a lot of movement, and on top of that, you also have Blink, or your Shimmer, which you can blink while casting. So you have a ton of movement as Mage, and it's imperative that you use it to its highest ability. So yeah, using your GCDs is really important, because you can't cast during that. Mine's a second and 1.37 seconds, so it's not like I can do anything during that time anyway. So might as well take that opportunity to move. Now we'll get into macros really quick, and there's some really cool macros that I use. There's 3 in particular that I use. There's 4 actually that I use. So there's the Frostbolt Macro, and this is actually intended to make the UI or the AI the AI in your frost element, your water elemental, to be smarter. Now, this way, so basically what it does is there's slash pet attack at target, and so if I'm at the target, and I'm using a Frostbolt, or I hit the button of that macro, which is going to be my Frostbolt. See how I replaced it down here? My tooltip is a little funky. I can't. It works for all my other ones. Show tooltip combustion. See, it works there, but it doesn't work on Frostbolt for some reason. And then so basically, if I'm using Frostbolt on a target, my character will be, or he will attack that target. The water elemental has this problem where it it it'll go off and do its own thing. Like a lot of the time, like Freehold comes into mind really quick, where it'll just start hitting a training dummy for no reason, and you'll forget that it's doing that, and then you'll realize that you're losing damage on the priority targets, which is really not beneficial. So this makes sure that it's always attacking the one that you're attacking. Then you do cast Frostbolt. And then there's the pet passive. So it puts it on passive if there's no targets. So if you see if I hit one here, which is my Frostbolt, it'll start attacking that. But if I get rid of my target and I hit one again, it'll put my pet on passive. So it's really nice. So it's just on an ability that just, smartens the AI, basically. Really recommend getting it because pet classes they tend to be a little spotty with their reliability. So they just this kind of just makes it nicer. A lot of hunters do the same thing, especially BM hunters. Now the next one I have, I guess I should do Blizzard, is the mouse over macro for Blizzard. And basically what it does is it takes wherever my mouse is, and instead of doing see, I'm gonna have to pull this up to show you guys what I mean. So the standard Blizzard, when you click it, it brings up this thing, and it takes the time adds up for where you click the ability, then have to choose where you're putting it down, and then click, and then it starts casting. So you lose a little bit of time on that, and the mouse over macro just makes it way more efficient. So I just have my mouse over here, and it starts casting immediately, and it'll cast Blizzard. So I just have to choose where I want it, and then just hit 4, which is my Blizzard button, and it'll automatically, so wherever I want to put it. And that's just cast in brackets at cursor end brackets Blizzard. And I have the exact same freeze thing for my freeze, or my water elemental's freeze ability. And you'll see I also have this keybound to Shift E, and that is incredibly important. I think you should really have this keybound because there's no way that you're going to be able to, use your Comet Storm and then into a freeze if you're down here clicking it, then dragging it up. So having it on a mouse over macro, just like the Blizzard is, it just makes it really, really nice. And then the last one I have is my Ice Block one. Now, because Ice Block is on the GCD, things can get a little hairy. So what this does, if we read it, basically it's stop casting. I do it 3 times because it's a little spotty. But the first one it does is cancel aura Ice Block. So if I'm not in an Ice Block, that's not possible. And then it's use Ice Block. And what that allows me to do, and this wasn't in my Arcane video, but I think it should have been, is to have an Ice Block where I can do it really quickly, like this. I can go in and out super fast, so it'll stop my casting and it'll take me in and out very quickly. And in a time where you got like a deadly dot on you or something like that, and like the third boss in King's Rest, they'll apply a dot on you that just hits like a truck, especially on Tyrannical. So being able to quickly ice block that off really, it really helps your healer out. And I highly recommend snagging that one up. But because of the GCD changes, and it's on the GCD now, the thing is that if I spam ice block, and which I'll do a lot, especially when I'm panicking and it's on the GCD and it doesn't happen right away, if I have this macro on that, and it's something that I want to, like maybe I'm going to die to a mechanic and I have to stay in ice block for an actual period of time and utilize the length of it, then if I'm spamming it and I keep spamming it by accident afterwards and I'm using this macro, it's going to take me immediately out and then ruin the whole point of ice blocking in the first place. So on my main mouse button, I have ice block and it's just the regular old run-of-the-mill one, but on my shift mouse button, I have the super duper fast one. So I'll hold down shift. So that was cold snap also. Resets the cooldown of your ice barrier, frost nova, cone of cold, but most importantly your ice block. That's what it's predominantly going to be used for, and it's on a 5-minute CD. And now I can, and so if I'm in a situation where I'm just trying to remove the dot, I can just really quick, never lose a, my DPS uptime is the exact, obviously I lose a couple seconds, but you're right back in there, ready to go. So yeah, I think that's about all that I want to talk about. That's all the things that I have to talk about. I really hope that you guys learned something. I think that Frost can be complicated and understanding how Shatter works, but you just want to think, if I want something to crit, then I want it to be frozen, whether that be through my pet ability Freeze, or if my pet ability Freeze, or through my Frozen Nova, or through the fact that uh, I got a Brain Freeze proc. Winter's Chill causes your target to take damage from your spells as if they were frozen. Or my Fingers of Frost. Fingers of Frost causes the next Ice Lance to deal the damage as if the target were frozen. So if you want it to crit, you want that target to be frozen. So Glacial Spike, you want your target to be frozen. So you wait for a Brain Freeze proc, then use Brain Freeze, or then use Glacial Spike into Flurry into Ice Lance, and that is the crux of Frost Mage. But after that, it's really simple. You get to 5 stacks, you use your Glacial Spike combo, and then you go back to the business, and you use your CDs as they come up. All right. Hope you guys enjoyed, and there'll be a fire guide coming soon. So I hope you guys are excited to see that. Goodbye.